I stood there silent, travel bag still dangling from my fingers, as the cruise agent glanced at me with pity. "She can't afford it," my daughter-in-law said, laughing, not realizing I was just steps away. No one noticed the way my son didn't correct her. No one noticed the way my heart cracked open quietly. I had packed joy. I'd brought sunscreen, books, and dreams. Instead, I bought the suite above theirs and made sure it had a balcony view. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Maggie poured herself a second cup of coffee, the kind that tasted more like ritual than refreshment. Outside, the Florida heat pressed against the windows, already promising a blistering afternoon. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish and cinnamon, leftover notes from yesterday's deep clean, but under it all was the quiet ache of something unspoken. She moved toward the hallway when she heard it. Sabrina's voice, sharp, clipped, and unmistakably on speakerphone, filtered from the guest room. "I mean, don't invite her. She can't afford it." Silence. Then the agent's reply, polite but uncertain. "You mean, your mother-in-law?" "Exactly," Sabrina said without a pause. "She lives on a fixed income. It would be uncomfortable for her, for everyone, honestly." Maggie froze. Her hand tightened around the coffee mug, knuckles going white. The travel agent murmured something about guest lists and deadlines. Sabrina replied breezily, "Just book us for the Ocean Sovereign, balcony suite, midship, cabin 9261. I want that one specifically." Then the call ended. Maggie backed up a step, slow and careful, like a glass figurine trying not to shatter. She didn't make a sound as she turned and walked back to the kitchen. Her heart hammered, not with rage, but something colder, something hollow and precise. Ethan's wife had always had a way of drawing boundaries with sugar-coated barbs, but this was different. She took a slow breath, let it sit in her lungs until it stung, then exhaled. She wouldn't confront her. Not now. Not ever, maybe. She had something better than confrontation. Footsteps on the stairs. Ethan walked in, keys jingling in one hand. "Hey, Mom, you see my sunglasses?" Maggie turned to him with a soft smile, masking the tremor still humming through her ribs. "Second drawer by the fridge, sweetheart." He kissed her cheek in passing, muttered something about traffic, and headed back out the door. As the latch clicked behind him, the smile slipped. Her hands were steady now, too steady. She reached for her laptop on the counter, flipped it open, and typed 2 words into the search bar: Ocean Sovereign. Within seconds, she was deep in a digital sea of cruise packages, glossy photos and deck plans, luxury suites, onboard butler service, champagne on arrival. Maggie clicked and scrolled, each detail a stitch in something she hadn't quite realized she'd been planning. She found it. Deck 10th, Penthouse Suite 10261, right above 9,261. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart thudding again, but now for a different reason. She glanced at her old retirement account login, open in another tab. It wasn't unlimited, but it was enough. And unlike Sabrina, she didn't blow money on image. She spent it on things that mattered. And some things, like dignity, were priceless. She reached for her phone and dialed the number she'd just memorized from Sabrina's call. It rang twice. "Thank you for calling Sunsea Voyages. This is Isla speaking." "Hello, Isla," Maggie said smoothly, her voice calm and warm. "I believe you just spoke to my daughter-in-law a few minutes ago." A pause. "Oh, yes, I remember. Are you calling to be added to their booking?" "No," Maggie said. "I'd like to make a separate reservation. Penthouse Suite 10,261. Same cruise, same dates. Of course, that's our top-tier luxury suite. One moment while I check availability." Maggie waited, staring out the kitchen window at the garden she'd kept alive through hurricanes and heat waves. She'd always been the kind of woman who rebuilt quietly. But now, she wasn't rebuilding. She was making a statement. "Good news," Isla returned. "It's available. Shall we proceed with booking?" Yes, Maggie said, and please keep it discreet. I'd like this to be a surprise. The keyboard clicks on the other end were brisk and efficient. Isla took her payment, confirmed the details, and added a few extras. Priority boarding, personal butler service, exclusive cocktail hours. When the call ended, Maggie closed the laptop and set her coffee cup in the sink, untouched. From the hallway, Sabrina laughed at something on her phone. That same voice, that same dismissiveness. Maggie didn't flinch this time. Instead, she walked upstairs, opened her cedar chest, and pulled out her old leather luggage set, the one Ethan had given her when his career had taken off, back when they'd meant their forevers. She ran her hand over the handle, eyes gleaming with something sharp and silent. This time she wouldn't be left behind. Maggie stepped out of the black town car just as the Florida sun burned off the last remnants of early morning fog. Port Miami glistened in the distance, white cruise ships gleaming like palaces on water, their decks stacked high like a billionaire's birthday cake. She adjusted the strap of her leather weekender, the one with the subtle monogram. She'd almost forgotten how it felt, traveling not for obligation or family, but for herself. The VIP entrance was tucked away from the crowds. A port attendant in crisp white offered her a smile. "Good morning, Miss Waverly. Right this way." The air inside the lounge was cool and quiet, the scent of polished wood and citrus diffusers hanging in the air. Maggie walked past travelers sipping complimentary champagne, her heels clicking softly on marble. There were no screaming children here, no souvenir bags, just plush seating, subtle jazz, and the confidence of those who belonged. She settled into a butter-soft leather chair near the window, facing the cruise ship that was now fully visible across the terminal glass. Ocean Sovereign, 10 decks of unapologetic luxury. She let her eyes trail upward, until they stopped at the balcony suite she now called her own. A voice cut through the lounge. "Ethan, they're letting people on already, oh!" Maggie turned. There they were, Sabrina in oversized sunglasses and a white linen romper that looked like it had never touched a dryer, and Ethan trailing behind her with 2 overstuffed roller bags and a confused expression. Sabrina's smile froze the moment she saw her. Not shocked, not even angry yet, just registering. Maggie offered her a gentle nod and the kind of polite smile usually reserved for distant acquaintances in grocery stores. "Good morning." Sabrina's gaze darted around as if trying to confirm she wasn't hallucinating. "Mom," Ethan muttered, setting the bags down. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, I decided to treat myself," Maggie said lightly, crossing one leg over the other. "It's been years since I took a real vacation." She let that sit for a moment. Ocean Sovereign seemed like a lovely choice. Ethan blinked. Sabrina recovered first, sliding off her sunglasses and letting her expression settle into something tighter. "That's quite a coincidence," she said, her tone dipped in faux surprise. Before either could say more, a uniformed attendant stepped into the lounge with a soft chime. "Priority guests for the Sovereign Penthouse, please proceed to boarding." Maggie rose smoothly, slipping the strap of her bag over her shoulder. "That's me." She smiled again, just enough to be civil. "See you on board." She didn't look back as she walked to the private boarding lane, but she could feel Sabrina's stare boring into her shoulder blades like sun through glass. The walk down the gangway was short, lined with velvet rope and cheerful crew members offering hand sanitizer and champagne. One woman, tall, elegant, with her hair pulled back in a sleek twist, stepped forward. "Ms. Waverly, I'm Claire, your penthouse butler. We've been expecting you." Claire offered a perfectly timed smile, then took her bag with practiced ease. "I've taken the liberty of stocking the minibar with the items you requested. Shall I show you to your suite?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Please." The elevator ride up was silent, except for the low hum of polished mechanics. When the doors opened, the hallway carpet was plush, the scent of eucalyptus, soft, but noticeable. Suite 10,261 had its own brass nameplate. Inside, hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a balcony view that spanned the ocean horizon. Claire walked her through the amenities, then excused herself with a promise to return before dinner. Maggie stepped onto the balcony, hands gripping the polished railing. Below, the ship was still boarding. Crowds bustled along the lower decks, ordinary passengers dragging their lives in rolling bags and overstuffed duffels. Somewhere beneath her feet, in cabin 9261, Sabrina was likely pacing. The breeze was warm and full of salt. Maggie closed her eyes, letting it pull at her hair. A door opened 2 floors down. She looked. Sabrina had stepped onto her balcony, arms crossed, scanning the decks. She didn't look up. Maggie lifted her champagne glass in a silent toast. Let the cruise begin. The dining room was a cathedral of crystal and cream, the kind of place designed to make people lower their voices and raise their standards. Linen napkins folded like orchids, waiters gliding across the floor in synchronized elegance. Maggie paused just inside the entrance, the hum of conversation washing over her like warm water. A hostess approached. "Ms. Waverly, your table is this way." As Maggie followed her across the floor, she caught a glimpse of Ethan and Sabrina already seated, tucked along the port side, just outside the warm glow of the captain's table. Sabrina's posture stiffened. She'd seen her. Maggie's table, however, was just 2 away from the captain's, angled with a perfect view of the room and the sea beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A prime spot. Not by chance. She slid into her seat with practiced ease, smoothing the sleeves of her soft navy wrap. Subtle elegance. No flash. Let Sabrina try to compete with that. A server poured sparkling water into cut crystal glasses. Maggie scanned the menu. Lobster medallions, aged filet, truffle risotto, the kind of choices that whispered rather than shouted. When the sommelier approached, Maggie didn't hesitate. "I'll have the Chateau Lagrange," she said, handing back the wine list with a serene smile. "The reserve label." The sommelier blinked in quiet approval. "Excellent choice." She didn't need to look over to know Sabrina was watching. She could feel it, the way you sense a heat source across a room. Sure enough, when she finally turned her head slightly, Sabrina leaned toward Ethan and said something behind her menu, something sharp enough to make him glance away in embarrassment. Within minutes, the wine arrived, deep velvet red in a decanter that gleamed under candlelight. Maggie let it breathe, then accepted a delicate pour. She raised her glass and toasted the sea quietly, sipping like a woman who had nothing to prove. Then, from the far side of the dining room, a familiar voice carried over the murmur of conversation. "Well, if it isn't the most elegant woman on Deck 10, Tomas, the cruise director." Maggie turned as he approached with an easy grin, arms open as if greeting a longtime friend. "Ms. Waverly," he said warmly, "you made it. I was hoping you would." Heads turned. Even the captain glanced over. Maggie stood to greet him, allowing just the right amount of familiarity in her tone. "Tomas, thank you for making this such a seamless experience already." "You're too kind." He rested a hand lightly on the back of her chair. "Everyone on staff knows your name already. And now that I see you've chosen the Chateau Lagrange, I may have to ask for a glass." She laughed softly, just enough to be heard without trying. "You're welcome any time." Tomas glanced at the others at her table, an older couple from Connecticut, a solo traveler with a Cartier watch, and gave them a nod of approval. "You've found a good crowd." As he left, someone from the next table leaned over. "How do you know the cruise director?" "Oh," Maggie said with a modest smile, "we've crossed paths before." That answer was vague enough to be intriguing and specific enough to suggest status. The older woman beside her leaned in, lowering her voice like sharing a secret. "Are you someone we should know?" Maggie gave a polite laugh and took another sip of wine. "Tonight, I'm just enjoying the ocean." The meal unfolded in waves: tender steak, chilled asparagus, white chocolate souffle. Conversation flowed more easily now. A few toasts were raised. Maggie answered curious questions without revealing too much, and every now and then she allowed her eyes to wander, just far enough to catch the way Sabrina's lips tightened every time someone laughed at Maggie's table. The sommelier returned, offering another pour. "Would you like to see the dessert wines?" "Actually," Maggie said, "I was thinking of hosting a small gathering. Nothing formal, just some after-dinner drinks in my suite. Would any of you like to join?" The table murmured their interest, nodding. The woman from Connecticut touched her wrist lightly. "Only if you promise to tell us how you got that room. It's got its own butler, doesn't it?" "I suppose you'll just have to come see for yourself." Across the room, Sabrina picked at her untouched dessert. Ethan said something to her. She didn't answer. Maggie stood slowly, her chair gliding back in near silence. "I'll see you all upstairs in half an hour." As she walked out, her heels whispering against the marble floor, she didn't look back at their table. She didn't need to. The real invitation had already been sent, and Sabrina hadn't received it. The tender boat rocked gently as it neared the private island, an opal smear of sand and palms rising from the Caribbean, like a secret. Maggie stood near the front, wind teasing at her linen scarf. Behind her, passengers buzzed with anticipation, clutching straw hats and waterproof bags, but she was calm, detached. She already knew what awaited her on shore. Claire had seen to it. The sand was impossibly white. As the crew helped guests off the boat, Maggie was met with a shaded golf cart, while most others were directed toward the public lounge chairs near the main beach. She was whisked away up a palm-lined path toward a secluded crescent of shoreline, where a canvas-draped cabana stood like a mirage. It was exactly where she'd asked them to place it, centerline view from the midship balconies. "Everything's chilled," Claire said as she opened the cooler, revealing bottles of Taitinger on ice. "Lobster sliders will be delivered within the hour. Anything else?" Maggie shook her head, slipping off her sandals and stepping onto the soft woven mat. "Just let me know if it starts getting crowded." Claire nodded with a conspiratorial smile. "It won't. This section's blocked off for private tier guests only. Enjoy." By the time Maggie had settled into the plush lounger with a chilled glass in hand, the beach below had started to fill. Children squealed, towels flapped, and vendors arranged kayaks in neat rows. And then, there they were. Ethan and Sabrina emerged from the crowd like they didn't belong to it. Sabrina in a high-cut designer swimsuit and oversized hat, Ethan looking like he hadn't slept well. Maggie didn't wave. She didn't even look directly, but she angled her lounger just so. Visible, undeniable. Sabrina spotted her first. Maggie watched in the corner of her vision as Sabrina's stride faltered, mouth tightening. Ethan's eyes lifted to the cabana, and his brows furrowed in disbelief. "Is that?" she heard him say. Sabrina snapped her fingers toward a beach attendant, motioning toward the other side of the island. "Let's go," she hissed. But Ethan lingered, halfway between confusion and curiosity. His gaze flicked up to Maggie again, like he wasn't sure if this was deliberate or divine. Then Claire returned, carrying 2 gleaming platters of lobster tails, grilled pineapple, and bowls of chilled melon. Right on cue, a group of 20-somethings in floaty cover-ups and mirrored sunglasses wandered past, slowing as they took in the scene. One of them, blonde, sunburnt, holding a GoPro, whispered loudly to her friend, "Is she someone, like an executive or something?" "Influencer, probably," the other replied. "Nobody gets that set up unless they're comped." Maggie smiled, slow and subtle. She leaned forward just enough for them to catch the label on the champagne. Then she raised her glass to no one in particular and sipped, never confirming, never denying. "Excuse me?" one of the girls asked. "Are you, like, hosting or filming or something?" Maggie gave her a soft smile. "I'm just relaxing. But if you're ever on deck 10, stop by." The girl lit up. "VIP, I knew it." As they drifted away, snapping selfies, a familiar voice approached from the other side of the cabana. "Well," said Thomas, stepping into view with his shoes in one hand, "if I'd known you'd be holding court, I'd have brought a gift." Maggie laughed lightly, shielding her eyes from the sun, just trying to enjoy the view. "You are the view," he said, settling onto the edge of a spare lounger. "Every crew member on the Sovereign knows your name by now, and some of the guests are asking if you're on the company board." "I like to keep people guessing," she said, eyes glinting. Tomas grinned, then gestured down toward the crowd. "Your son and his wife look flustered." Maggie didn't follow his gaze. "They're adjusting." Claire returned again, this time with a chilled towel, and offered it to Maggie with a small bow. Tomas raised his brows, impressed. "You really are royalty up here." Maggie looked out over the sea, where the water met the sky in one endless sapphire ribbon. "Not royalty," she murmured, "just someone who stopped waiting for permission." Below, on the sand, Sabrina turned her back to the cabana. Ethan glanced up once more, caught Maggie's eye, then quickly looked away. Maggie leaned back into the lounger and closed her eyes, the breeze lifting the corner of her scarf like a ribbon in flight. This wasn't even the main event yet. The ballroom-style dining hall glowed in amber and gold as guests filtered in, heels clicking on marble, champagne flutes clinking in the air like gentle bells. A string quartet played something old and expensive near the staircase. Maggie stepped in slowly, dressed in a floor-length midnight blue gown that shimmered when she moved. Her hair was swept back in a soft chignon, silver at the temples catching the light like a deliberate choice, not age, but armor. Every head didn't turn. But some did, and they were the right ones. Claire had delivered the gown earlier that afternoon, wrapped in tissue paper with a handwritten note. Tonight's energy, effortless triumph. It had made Maggie laugh out loud, but now, under these chandeliers, it was exactly what she embodied. The maitre d' greeted her with a respectful nod. "Captain Dela Cruz is expecting you, Miss Waverly. Right this way." They walked toward the elevated central table, past others seated in clusters of noise and laughter. Maggie didn't search for Ethan or Sabrina, but when she passed their table, low-lit, off to the side, she felt the air shift. Sabrina's eyes narrowed. Ethan's fork paused mid-air. Maggie smiled softly at the captain as he stood and extended a hand. "Ms. Waverly," he said, voice rich and warm. "Finally." They shook hands. Cameras clicked discreetly. "I've heard wonderful things," he continued as she took her seat beside him. "Tomas speaks very highly of you." Maggie gave a modest nod. "He's been a gracious host." Tomas, already seated on the other side, raised his glass. "This one's been keeping her brilliance under wraps. Background in public education, district leadership, mentorship programs, you name it." The captain raised his brows. "That's so?" Maggie gave him a smile, surprised but not embarrassed. "I've had a long career, retired now." "Nonsense," the captain said. "Wisdom doesn't retire, it evolves." More cameras flashed, official ones now. The photographer from the ship's media team captured candids as champagne was poured and the first course served, diver scallops in saffron butter. Maggie found herself mid-conversation with a sculptor from New York and the CEO of a wellness brand based in Santa Barbara. There was a rhythm to this kind of table, carefully curated, full of people who'd learned how to ask just the right question without ever sounding interested in gossip. But gossip was happening, whether they voiced it or not. Across the room, Sabrina shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her white halter gown, though expensive, now looked like it was trying too hard. She whispered something to Ethan. He gave a non-committal nod and reached for his water. By the time dessert arrived, fig tarts with whipped ricotta and burnt honey, Maggie was laughing softly at a story about port inspections in Morocco. The captain leaned in to say something, and Tomas caught it, smiling. Then a movement. Sabrina stood abruptly, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, audible even across the room. Sabrina shook her head a little too dramatically. "Just not feeling great." She walked out, not toward the restrooms, but toward the exit. Several guests glanced after her. Ethan hesitated, torn between following or finishing his meal. He chose silence and the latter. Claire approached Maggie's side quietly, a small black envelope in hand. No one else received one. "For you, Ms. Waverly," she said discreetly. "From the captain. A private shore excursion. Details enclosed. Small group. Invitation only." Maggie tucked it into her clutch without a word. The violinists transitioned into something swelling and cinematic. A toast was raised, laughter bubbled around her, and for the first time on this cruise, Maggie didn't feel like she was performing. She felt seen. From the side of the room, Tomas caught her eye and tilted his glass ever so slightly. "You're in now." And she was. The sea was starting to gold. From her penthouse balcony, Maggie watched the sun slip lower, draping the ship in molten light. The brass rail was warm beneath her fingers, the wind softer now, like even the ocean had decided to slow down and listen. Inside her suite, the preparations had already begun. Claire moved with efficient grace, lighting floating candles in low bowls and placing chilled cocktail glasses on the credenza. "The hors d'oeuvres will arrive in 10 minutes, she said, smoothing the edge of a linen runner. "Do you need anything else?" "Yes," Maggie replied. She opened a small leather envelope, pulled out a thick stack of crisp bills, and handed it to Claire with no ceremony. "Split this with the event staff. Everyone who helps tonight, generously." Claire didn't flinch. She accepted it with both hands and a quiet nod. "You'll have nothing to worry about. I already don't." As Claire exited, Maggie turned toward the mirrored wall and adjusted one silver earring. The dress she wore was slate gray, backless, with a drape that shimmered when she moved. Less formal than the captain's table, but deliberate, chic without trying. The invitation had gone out quietly. Just a dozen or so guests, curated. The Connecticut couple from the first night, the wellness CEO, Tomas, the sculptor, a retired judge who'd shared a sharp laugh with her over dessert. They were the kind of people who didn't need name-dropping or social climbing. They recognized orbit when they saw it. She hadn't invited Ethan or Sabrina. That part wasn't personal, it was surgical. But news, as always, traveled faster than discretion. Down on Deck 9, Sabrina stood in line at the gelato stand when someone from Maggie's cocktail list, an elegantly sunburned woman with a heavy strand of pearls, smiled and said, "See you tonight at the penthouse, right?" Sabrina blinked. "What?" "Oh, Maggie's hosting a private thing. Cocktails and canapes, sunset views. Didn't she tell you?" The woman tilted her head. "Maybe it's just a VIP thing." And just like that, the spark ignited. Back in the penthouse, the guests arrived in a staggered stream of subtle glamour and murmured appreciation. Claire moved quietly between them with a tray of sea salt gougères and caviar-topped cucumber rounds. Tomas arrived 5 minutes late, holding a bottle of small-batch bourbon. "For the hostess," he said with a grin. "Only if you pour the first round," Maggie replied, motioning toward the balcony. Laughter drifted out with the music, something jazzy, slowed down. Maggie's suite felt more like a rooftop lounge in Manhattan than a ship at sea. There were no plastic chairs, no cruise banners. Just low conversation, velvet shadows and the glitter of cut glass catching sunset. Across the balcony, she caught Ethan in the crowd below. Not up, not part of it, just nearby. He looked up briefly, met her gaze, and then looked away. Maggie sipped her drink, smiled at a comment from the judge, and let the moment pass. Let him sit in it. Back inside, the sculptor was showing off sketches in a leather-bound book. The CEO was exchanging cards with the judge's spouse. Maggie didn't need to steer the conversation, only to gently redirect it, like a conductor whose orchestra already knew the music. And all the while, the tension simmered, because someone wasn't here, Sabrina. And that was no accident. Maggie had calculated this night like an architect sketches a foundation. The people here weren't just allies, they were witnesses. They'd remember the woman who hosted this, the woman whose suite overlooked it all. Later, as twilight turned to a soft navy sky, Claire approached with a whisper. She came to the door. Maggie raised a brow. "And?" She asked why she wasn't on the guest list. Maggie smiled, slow and cool. "What did you say?" "I said the list was finalized days ago, VIP tier only." "And her reaction?" Claire hesitated. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. Maggie turned back toward her guests and lifted her glass again. They were toasting something, but only she knew what it really was. It was well past midnight when the knock came. Soft, almost hesitant, 2 quick raps, then silence. Maggie stood barefoot in the center of her suite, silk robe wrapped loosely around her, tea cooling in her hand. The cocktail party had ended hours ago, its laughter and music now folded into the shadows. Claire had cleaned everything with quiet precision before disappearing into the corridor with a final, "Good night, Ms. Waverly." She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again. She opened the door. Ethan stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders slouched in that way he used to after high school basketball games they'd lost by 20 points. "Did I wake you?" he asked, voice low. "No," she said. "Come in." He stepped over the threshold slowly, glancing around. The suite was dim now, lit only by a standing lamp and the soft glow of the balcony lights. The air smelled faintly of lavender and aged bourbon. His eyes landed on the empty wine glasses, the scattered cocktail napkins with delicate gold trim. "So," he said, hands still in his pockets, "you threw a party?" Maggie raised an eyebrow as she walked past him toward the bar. "Would you like some tea?" "Not really." She poured herself a fresh cup anyway. Ethan stood near the glass doors, looking out at the dark sea. "This room? It's insane." Sabrina looked up the price. "It's more than what we paid for our entire trip." Maggie didn't respond. He turned to face her. "Mom, seriously, how did you afford this?" She sipped her tea. "I've been saving." "For what? Cruises?" "For experiences that matter." She met his eyes. "Not things. Not status. Not approval." Ethan blinked. "But this is about status, isn't it?" She tilted her head. "Not mine." A beat of silence stretched between them, the kind that used to exist only when they'd argued over curfews or college applications. But they weren't mother and teenage son anymore. They were two adults, one of whom had underestimated the other. "Sabrina's upset," he said finally. "I imagine she is." "She thinks you're trying to humiliate her." Maggie let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "I'm enjoying myself, that's all." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't feel like that from the outside." "That's not my concern, Ethan." She set the teacup down. "You know, when your father passed, I told myself I'd spend the next decade being quiet, gracious, small. I clipped coupons, turned down invitations, let people talk over me at Thanksgiving, and the one time I decide to take up space, she's offended? She thinks it's calculated." "Then she's paying closer attention than I thought." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "She's not used to being excluded." Maggie walked to her desk and pulled out a slim, black leather folder, the kind used for hosting arrangements. She opened it. A small list of names was written inside in perfect cursive. Some had gold stars beside them. She looked up at him. "Neither was I." He didn't say anything. "I didn't do this to compete, Ethan. I'm not even angry anymore. But I'm also not interested in shrinking." Ethan shifted on his feet, the guilt visible now, pooling in his posture, softening his voice. "You've changed." "I've remembered." He looked toward the door. "She's going to be mad that I came here." "I didn't ask you to." Another pause. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Ethan." He walked out without looking back. Maggie stood in the silence for a long time before closing the folder gently. One name caught her eye. The judge's spouse, Sarah something, had suggested a portside jazz tasting for tomorrow. Claire had said the staff could arrange something custom if asked early. Maggie circled the name and reached for her phone. Tomorrow was another chance to raise the bar and narrow the guest list. The gala shimmered like a mirage, gold light refracting off polished brass, gowns flowing like water, and live cello reverberating through the ship's grand ballroom. Maggie stepped inside with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed a spotlight. Her dress was deep emerald, cut simply but elegantly, the kind that didn't announce itself until someone tried to forget it. Claire had pinned a vintage brooch near her shoulder, her late husband's, something that caught the light when she turned. She didn't need to look far to find Sabrina. At the opposite end of the ballroom, Sabrina stood near the champagne tower, encased in a fiery red designer gown with a slit to her thigh and a neckline that defied gravity. Her makeup was sharp, camera ready, her smile even sharper. She saw Maggie, held her gaze. Game on. Guests mingled under vaulted ceilings, sipping drinks that came topped with edible flowers and speaking in tones that never quite rose above polite astonishment. Tomas made rounds like a conductor, gently tuning the social instrument around him. As the clock neared 9, the lights dimmed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced from the podium near the stage, "thank you for joining us tonight at our Sovereign Gala. Tonight's proceeds benefit our Crew Legacy Scholarship, supporting education for the families of our most dedicated staff." A round of applause swelled, polite and warm. A glittering assistant wheeled out the first item, an original oil seascape by a prominent Miami painter. The starting bid, $1,200. Bids came slow at first, then a voice rang out, sharp and unmistakable. "2,000! Sabrina called from her seat near the front. She smiled wide, flicking her hair back for the benefit of the watching crowd. Ethan looked vaguely uncomfortable beside her, but said nothing. The assistant nodded. 2,000 from the lady in red. Maggie didn't move. She waited. Someone else raised it to $2,300. Sabrina upped it to $2,800, crossing her legs with the poise of someone playing for cameras that weren't there. 3,000, someone murmured. Then 32. The assistant scanned the room. "Do I hear 35? Maggie lifted her paddle with a serene hand. 10,000. The room stilled, a collective breath, then murmurs, soft, impressed. Tomas looked over and raised his eyebrows, amused. The assistant blinked. 10,000 going once. Sabrina straightened. 12, she said quickly, voice a little too loud. A pause. Maggie lifted her paddle again. 30, she said. Gasps, scattered applause. The assistant recovered. 30,000 to the penthouse suite. Sabrina's smile cracked just slightly. She leaned toward Ethan, whispered something with urgency. He checked his phone, lips pressed into a line. "Would you like to raise your bid, ma'am?" the assistant prompted. Sabrina stood. "Yes, 40. A flicker of something, pride, panic, maybe both. The assistant smiled. "Very generous. 40,000 from the lady in red. Going once." Then a pause. A crew member approached the stage quietly, whispering something in the assistant's ear. The woman froze, nodded faintly, then turned back to the crowd with a measured expression. "I'm very sorry," she said. "It appears the last bid cannot be honored. We're reverting to the previous high offer." A beat of silence. 30,000 from Ms. Waverly. Sold. Applause broke out. Not wild, but sincere. Sabrina was still standing, her cheeks flushed crimson now. Ethan whispered something. She shook her head. "No," she said aloud, her voice tighter than she intended. "That's not possible. Try the card again." A second crew member approached her quietly. More whispers. A furrowed brow. Sabrina's hands curled into fists at her sides. Then, without another word, she turned and walked straight out of the ballroom. Ethan followed, slower, and not before casting one lingering look at Maggie. It held something complicated, not anger, not quite shame, but not understanding either. Maggie remained seated, still, graceful. Claire stepped beside her a moment later. "Would you like the painting delivered to your suite?" "Please." "And the charge?" "Use the family account," Maggie said simply. "The one Sabrina used to have access to." Claire gave the faintest nod. Understood. Maggie looked out over the ballroom, now humming again with conversation, unaware that a quiet shift had just occurred. Some lines, once redrawn, stay permanent. The sun was still low when the call came. "Ms. Waverly," Claire said gently from the intercom, "the captain is ready for your tour. If you'd like to meet him on deck 12, portside staircase." Maggie smiled, already dressed in white linen slacks and a tailored navy blouse. Clean lines. Quiet power. She passed the mirror in the hallway without checking it. The bridge of the Ocean Sovereign was a cathedral of glass and steel, humming with soft monitors and steady voices. The view stretched endlessly, miles of open water framed by the curvature of the earth. Everything here felt precise, balanced, controlled. Captain Dela Cruz greeted her with a warm handshake. "Always good to give this tour to someone who actually understands leadership." She laughed. "Well, I've seen enough school board chaos to appreciate a well-run ship." He walked her through every panel, every control, explained the rotations, the radar, introduced her to the first mate, the helmsman. One of the junior crew members offered her a headset to hear intercom traffic. She listened, fascinated, sipping espresso from a mug stamped with the ship's crest. At one point, the ship photographer arrived, invited by the captain. They posed beside the navigation console, the horizon perfectly centered behind them. The captain smiled for the camera. Maggie didn't smile. She let the moment carry its own weight. "This will go on the daily newsletter and the digital screens," the photographer said cheerfully. "Passengers love to see who's visiting the bridge." "I'm sure they do," Maggie said with a polite nod. By mid-afternoon, her face appeared beside the captain's on the digital signage outside every elevator, a rotating slideshow that read, "Special Guest Tour, Bridge Access, Ms. Margaret Waverly, Educator and Advocate." By dinner, strangers were stopping her in the corridor. "You're the one who got the bridge tour, right? I loved what the captain said about your work. Do you speak publicly?" Even the staff took notice. A wine steward bowed slightly when presenting her glass. A new towel in her suite bore her initials, embroidered without request. She didn't search for Ethan and Sabrina that night in the dining room, but she didn't need to. The hostess led her past their table on the way to hers. Ethan looked up. Sabrina didn't. Her gaze stayed locked on her bread plate as if studying its imperfections. Maggie's table, as usual, was angled for ocean views and filled with lively voices. Sarah, the judge's wife, was recounting a harrowing excursion misstep in Cozumel. Someone else asked Maggie about her work in schools. The couple from Connecticut toasted to unexpected friendships. Across the room, Sabrina reached for her water glass with a twitchy hand and missed it slightly, tipping ice across the tablecloth. Ethan tried to help. She waved him off. By dessert, passengers from another table sent over a note. "You're becoming our cruise legend, Ms. Waverly." Claire retrieved it and read it quietly before smiling. "You're making an impression." "I'm just enjoying the ride," Maggie replied. But inside, it felt different. Not vindictive, not prideful, just right. For years, she had been edited out of the narrative, folded into corners, smoothed down like an old dollar bill. Now, she wasn't asking for a spotlight. She simply wasn't stepping out of one when it came. When the check was presented, Claire leaned in discreetly. "The painting from the auction has been hung in the suite. Would you like to see it now?" "Not yet," Maggie said. "Let it surprise me." At the far table, Ethan looked over again. His expression was harder to read now, less guilt, more curiosity. A man wondering which chapter he'd just walked into halfway through. Sabrina said nothing, didn't acknowledge Maggie once, but Maggie caught the way her fingers tapped, anxious and fast, against the underside of her chair. Something was unraveling, but it wasn't Maggie, and as she stood to leave, applause broke out from another table as she passed. She paused, nodded graciously, and kept walking. Tomorrow, she had a new list, and Sabrina's name wasn't on it. The upper promenade was quiet just after sunrise. Most guests were still asleep or nursing early espressos from the aft cafe. Maggie sat alone on a teak bench overlooking the water, a soft breeze lifting the ends of her cardigan. She was halfway through her second cup of black coffee when Ethan appeared. No Sabrina. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense, as if the morning itself carried weight he didn't want to name. "Do you mind?" he asked. Maggie gestured to the open spot beside her. "Have a seat." He sat, but not close, just enough distance to keep it neutral. They watched the waves in silence for a moment. "She's angry," Ethan said finally. Maggie didn't respond. She said she feels embarrassed, exposed. Still, she said nothing. "She thinks you're doing all of this to punish her." Maggie turned slightly enough to face him. "And you?" she asked. "What do you think?" Ethan sighed, the kind of slow exhale that carried the weight of someone trapped between loyalty and truth. I think she's not used to being the one left out. She left me out, Maggie said quietly but clearly. He frowned. What do you mean? I heard her, she said, turning back to the water. That morning in the kitchen, on speakerphone. Don't invite her, she can't afford it. Her voice didn't shake. It was flat, matter of fact. She said it to the travel agent, like I wasn't in the next room. Ethan flinched. You heard that? Maggie nodded. I'm sorry, he said, but it came out more like a reflex than a confession. No, you're not, she replied gently. Not really, you're sorry I heard it, but you're not sorry she said it. Ethan's jaw tensed. She resents you, he said after a long pause. That you don't need anyone's help, that you can walk into a room and own it. She feels like you're showing her up. Maggie gave a quiet laugh. I'm not here to compete with your wife, Ethan. I know that, he said, but she doesn't. Maggie sipped her coffee, then set the cup down on the bench. I spent years making myself smaller so others wouldn't feel insecure. You know what it got me? He didn't answer. A guest room, a fixed smile at family dinners, and, apparently, exclusion from a cruise I was never supposed to know about. That wasn't fair, he admitted. No, she said, but it was honest. She didn't want me there, so I came anyway. On my own terms. Ethan stared out at the water, quiet. You're not upset? He asked, almost surprised. I'm not interested in being liked anymore, Ethan. I'm interested in being whole. He nodded slowly, the muscles in his face working through something unspoken. She's not taking any of this well. I can imagine. She's already talking about salvaging her dignity, whatever that means. Maggie gave a slow blink, her voice cool now. It means she's about to cause a scene. Ethan didn't argue. She's impulsive, he said, and prideful. Maggie stood, smoothing her cardigan and picking up her cup. Then she's going to hate what's next. Ethan looked up at her, startled. What do you mean? But she didn't answer, not directly. She looked out at the sea one more time, then back at her son. You remember the chessboard we used to keep in the den? He furrowed his brow. Yeah? Do you remember what I used to say when you rushed to take a pawn? He was silent for a beat, then, don't grab the pawn if it costs you the queen. She smiled. Exactly. And with that, she turned and walked away. Ethan sat there for a long time after she left, watching the sea roll out into silence. Whatever Sabrina had planned, Maggie would be 3 moves ahead. It hit just after midnight. The wind came first, slamming against the hull with sudden force, rattling lounge furniture and sending deck umbrellas tumbling like toys. Rain followed in heavy sheets, pounding the ship's glass and steel like fists. The ocean sovereign groaned beneath it all, the weight of the sea rising like a mood too long ignored. Maggie was in the library lounge when the first wave of fear set in. A sharp tilt, then a jolt. Glasses clinked, a child cried. Somewhere, someone screamed. The cruise director's voice crackled through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain indoors. Crew members are on their way to assist. This is a temporary squall and we're managing it. Stay calm. The lounge lights flickered once, then steadied. A crew member barely older than 20 hurried in, soaked and wide-eyed. We need to gather passengers away from the outer corridors. Someone said the east stairwell is leaking. Maggie stood immediately. I'll help organize people in here. Keep them seated. Keep them calm. The young man blinked. Are you staff? She gave him a tight, kind smile. Tonight I can be. Within minutes, she'd turned the upscale lounge into a kind of haven. Throw blankets from reading chairs were handed to shivering guests. Coffee was poured from behind the unmanned bar. A man with a limp was helped into a recliner. A couple from Ohio, trembling, were talked through breathing exercises. Children clung to their mothers. Maggie crouched low to meet their eyes, voice steady. This ship is stronger than any storm, just like you. Crew came and went, grateful, frantic. Each time they entered, they found order. Calm. Claire appeared eventually, carrying a first aid kit and a roll of towels. "I had a feeling you'd be here." "You're not the only one," Maggie murmured. When the worst of the wind finally passed and the stabilizers kicked in, the guests began to loosen. The storm outside was still fierce, but the inside had settled. Then came the applause, scattered at first, then full. One of the crewmen, wet, windblown, exhausted, stood near the door and clapped with a bowed head. Others joined in, not the kind of applause reserved for performance, the kind reserved for people who show up. The next morning, the skies were clean, falsely bright, the way Florida gets after a tantrum. Shipboard monitors across the decks displayed a message from the captain. "Thank you to our wonderful guests for your patience during last night's storm, and a special thank you to Ms. Margaret Waverly for her outstanding assistance and leadership." Below it was a photo. Maggie, hair slightly windblown, kneeling beside a child wrapped in a tartan blanket. She wasn't smiling, but she didn't have to. The moment said everything. The image looped every 10 minutes on screens outside the dining rooms, the spa, the theater. At breakfast, she couldn't get through the buffet line without someone reaching out. "That was you, wasn't it? We heard what you did in the lounge. You really should work here, you know." She thanked them all graciously, but kept moving. She had no interest in basking. Across the room, Ethan watched from his table, half-eaten toast on his plate. Sabrina sat beside him, arms crossed, staring at her untouched orange juice. She hadn't left their cabin once during the storm. He finally spoke without turning. "You know, she didn't have to help." Sabrina didn't respond. She could have stayed in her suite and watched it all pass, but she didn't. Silence stretched. "Did you see the photo?" he asked. Still nothing. She was with a scared little boy, holding his hand, talking to him like it was nothing. Finally, Sabrina muttered, "Maybe she just wanted another PR moment." Ethan looked at her fully for the first time in days. She didn't even know the cameras were there. That landed. Maggie crossed the dining hall then, nodding to a waiter, chatting briefly with a woman in a wheelchair. She looked peaceful, energized even. No one would have guessed she'd slept barely 3 hours. She passed their table. Sabrina didn't look up, but Ethan did. And this time, he stood. "Maggie," he said softly. She paused, raised an eyebrow. "I saw what you did." She gave a small, tired smile. "It wasn't much." "It was more than most." They held eye contact for a second too long. Then Sabrina finally snapped, "Are you coming, Ethan?" He hesitated, just long enough to make it count. And as Maggie walked away, the applause from the lounge echoed back, not in sound, but in memory. She didn't need revenge anymore. She had respect, and that was louder. The last formal night aboard the Ocean Sovereign shimmered with ceremony. Strings played something rich and slow. Candles flickered in crystal holders. Every table had been reset to perfection. Guests arrived in sequins, in tuxedos, in their finest cruise smiles. But none of it mattered once Maggie stepped in. She wore silver, not a cold, metallic silver, but a satin, moonlit hue that clung to her like peace. No necklace, no earrings, just the glint of her wedding ring and a thin cuff bracelet at her wrist. Her hair was swept up, loose tendrils framing her face, softening the strength in her eyes. The maitre d' saw her and immediately stepped forward, escorting her past the murmuring tables. Cameras flashed, subtle, ship-approved ones, but all eyes were already tracking her steps, even Sabrina's. Maggie didn't glance her way. She took her seat at the captain's table with the quiet poise of someone who had already said everything worth saying. Halfway through dinner, just as the dessert wine was being poured and the conversation began to drift toward disembarkation, the captain stood. "If I may," he said, lifting his glass, "I'd like to recognize a guest whose presence this week has reminded us all that leadership doesn't always wear a uniform." The room hushed. "Ms. Margaret Waverly," he said, gesturing toward her, "educator, advocate, and as many of you witnessed during the storm, someone who leads with grace, not noise." Applause began, steady and real. Maggie rose, slow and graceful, and lifted her glass as the captain stepped aside. "I don't usually give speeches," she said. "I've spent most of my life making room for other voices, students, teachers, family." She paused, letting that last word hang, not accusing, just truthful. "But this week reminded me that sometimes you have to stop asking for space and simply stand in it." More applause. She nodded toward the staff lining the edges of the room, servers, butlers, stewards, all in crisp black and whites. "I saw what this crew did during the storm, what they do every day, what most of us miss while we sip our wine and talk about excursions." Several heads nodded. A few of the crew looked down, bashful. "So," she continued, her voice clear but quiet, "I'd like to honor them properly." She reached into her evening clutch and pulled out a small, folded slip. Claire stepped forward and placed a microphone in front of her as if they'd rehearsed this. "I'm donating $50,000 to the Crew Legacy Scholarship Fund, effective immediately." The silence cracked. Gasps, then applause, then a full, standing ovation. Maggie waited for it to settle before speaking again. "And I won't be managing the program alone," she added, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Ethan, wide-eyed at a nearby table. She smiled. "My son Ethan will be co-chairing the effort. He's got a good mind for organization, and a lot to make up for." Laughter rippled through the room, warm, not cruel. Maggie let it land. Ethan slowly stood, unsure whether to bow, nod, or salute. In the end, he just gave a sheepish, stunned half-wave. The spotlight hit him. For once, he didn't shrink from it. At the far table, Sabrina sat frozen. She hadn't touched her meal. Her makeup was flawless, her posture stiff, but something in her face had cracked. She looked not angry, but hollow, like a chess player who just realized she'd lost the game 10 moves ago. She didn't clap. She didn't speak. She just stared. Maggie turned back to the captain and handed him the signed donation slip. "To the crew," she said, raising her glass. "To the crew," the captain echoed, and the room followed. The music picked back up, but softer now, respectful, reverent. Ethan made his way toward Maggie's table, tentative, curious. Before he could speak, Claire leaned down beside Maggie and whispered something. Maggie nodded once without breaking her expression. Then she looked up at Ethan. "We'll talk later," she said. "I still have something else to do." Something Sabrina would never see coming. The disembarkation lounge buzzed with polite chaos. Luggage carts rolled past with soft thuds. Passengers leaned over coffee cups, clutching their final mimosas and comparing excursion notes. The end of the cruise always had this strange, liminal feel, half goodbye, half planning for next time. Maggie sat in the priority lounge, legs crossed at the ankle, a linen travel blazer over her ivory blouse. Claire had already sent her bags ahead. Her coffee was still hot. She had no reason to rush. The reservation desk in the corner had a small placard, "Next year's bookings, VIP priority." Maggie watched with a faint smile as Isla, the ship's travel agent, adjusted her headset and scanned the small line of platinum-tier guests. It wasn't the same Isla who had whispered, "Don't invite her," into a speakerphone months ago, but the same job, the same desk, the same ship. Just a different world now. Moments later, Isla spotted her. "Oh, Ms. Waverly?" She came around the desk with practiced polish, hands clasped. "I was hoping you'd stop by." Maggie stood. "I assume you're offering me first pick." "Of course," Isla said, already guiding her toward the private table behind the desk. "Our top-tier guests get first access to the next season's itineraries, and given your contribution last night?" She smiled, carefully deferential. "I'd say you're at the top of that list." Maggie sat across from her. Glancing over the tablet, Isla slid forward. Caribbean, Mediterranean, Alaska, all the polished promises of next year's ocean paths. But Maggie didn't scroll. She tilted her head. "Actually, I think I'll stick with the same itinerary." Isla blinked. "Oh, yes, absolutely. And which cabin would you prefer?" Maggie folded her hands. "Deck 10, penthouse, same one." Isla nodded, already tapping her screen. "Cabin 1001, That one overlooks. Deck 9. Yes, Maggie said, directly above 921. Isla's fingers paused for half a beat, but she didn't question it. It's yours. Shall I go ahead and lock it in? Before Maggie could answer, a familiar voice drifted over from the cafe behind them. Maggie? Ethan. He looked casual, sling bag over one shoulder, a coffee in his hand. A half-worn expression of surprise on his face, like he'd genuinely just stumbled upon her. You're booking another one? He asked, approaching slowly. Maggie offered him a serene smile. Why not? His gaze dropped to the screen. When he saw the cabin number, something in his face twitched, and then it softened. A half-smile. Resigned. Maybe impressed. You're going again next year? He asked. She sipped her coffee. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. He nodded once, like someone acknowledging a truth they'd fought against and finally accepted. Good. From across the lobby, a sharp voice rang out. Ethan, let's go! Sabrina. Standing beside a luggage cart, sunglasses on despite the indoor light, tapping her foot like the floor had personally offended her. Her jaw was tight, her hands tighter. She looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. Her eyes darted toward Maggie, saw the booking screen, saw Isla leaning in, and knew immediately exactly what cabin that was. Maggie didn't look at her. She just turned to Isla. Go ahead and confirm it. Would you like to use the same payment method? Isla asked, already smiling. Absolutely. A few more taps. A cheerful beep. Booked, Isla said. We'll send the itinerary next week, and of course we'll make sure you have first access to the pre-cruise lounge and concierge menu. Maggie stood, straightened her cuff, and offered her hand. Thank you, Isla. You've been wonderful. Isla beamed, shaking it. It's been our honor, Ms. Waverly. Behind them, Ethan gave a small shake of his head, but not in disapproval. In disbelief. In awe. Sabrina turned on her heel and stormed toward the exit. Ethan followed, but not before glancing back once more. Maggie caught his eye and gave him the slightest wink. Not cruel, not smug. Just a reminder, you underestimated the wrong woman. She turned to Isla. Now, she said with a quiet laugh, what are your thoughts on hosting a private jazz tasting on board? Port Everglades shimmered under a pale morning haze as the ocean sovereign nudged into its berth. Lines were cast. The ship's horns sounded once, deep and final, as the cruise came to its elegant close. Maggie stood on Deck 10's balcony one last time, sipping espresso from a white porcelain cup. Below, port staff moved like ants, luggage sorted, customs officers stationed, buses lined up in painted lanes. A final choreography of endings. She'd already checked out. Claire had handled everything. Her suitcase was en route to the VIP terminal. Her driver was waiting. No scramble, no checklist, no stress, just the end, arriving exactly on time. The VIP disembarkation lane was cordoned off with navy ropes and gold stanchions. Passengers in heels and baseball caps lined up on the main gangway, murmuring instructions about luggage tags and TSA checks. But Maggie bypassed it all. The concierge staff opened the velvet rope without being asked. Good morning, Ms. Waverly, one of them said. The captain's waiting for a quick farewell. She descended the private ramp, where Captain Dela Cruz stood near the press kiosk, his hat in hand, flanked by port security. Ms. Waverly, he greeted her warmly, thank you for everything this week. The scholarship committee will reach out within the month. Maggie offered her hand. My pleasure, Captain. You run a fine ship. A photographer from the Port Gazette stepped forward. One photo? For our local feature on dignitary guests? The captain smiled. Absolutely. Maggie positioned herself beside him, not stiff, not rehearsed, just present. A calm gaze into the camera. A sliver of wind caught the hem of her linen jacket as the shutter clicked. Later, her photo would appear online with the caption, Local Educator Honored at Sea, Leadership and Legacy Aboard the Ocean Sovereign. Meanwhile, back in the main crowd, Sabrina moved slowly, a rolling suitcase rattling behind her on a sticky wheel. Her wide-brimmed hat was askew. Her lipstick had faded at the corners. Her phone buzzed with an unread balance notification. No staff came to greet her, no photographer, no fanfare, just customs, heat, and a long line of nothing special. Ethan trailed beside her, silent. He glanced toward the VIP exit as Maggie emerged on the opposite ramp, flanked by a uniformed attendant and 2 cruise executives. He didn't wave, but he did watch. Sabrina looked up just as Maggie stepped onto the curb where a black town car waited, engine already running, air conditioning humming. The driver opened the door without comment. Before slipping inside, Maggie turned. She caught Isla by the terminal wall, clipboard in hand, hair tied up, already processing a new line of guests for the afternoon sailing. Maggie raised a hand, smiling. Isla beamed and waved back, the kind of wave reserved for someone you're already expecting again. Sabrina froze mid-step. She watched Maggie slide into the waiting car with not a glance backward. The door shut softly. The car pulled away with quiet authority, disappearing down the private drive. No one clapped, no one scowled, no one even noticed, except her. And that was worse. Sabrina stood there, swallowed by the noise of roller bags, barking porters, sunburned families dragging too many souvenirs. All that effort, all that posturing. And she still walked off this ship like background noise. The driver's taillights flicked once before vanishing behind the exit gates. Maggie didn't wave again. She didn't need to, because for the first time in years, she wasn't following anyone else's route. She had arrived, on her own terms, and left just the same. And Sabrina? She wasn't even on the map. The house smelled like lemon oil and sunlight. Maggie stepped inside with slow grace, letting the door close behind her. Everything was just as she'd left it. The books stacked by the reading chair, the kitchen calendar still flipped to July, the wind chimes outside whispering to no one in particular. She slipped off her shoes and padded into the living room. Claire's farewell gift sat atop her mail pile, neatly wrapped in navy paper, tied with a ribbon the exact color of sea foam. A small envelope tucked beneath the bow read, simply, "For when the view feels far away." Maggie opened it last. Inside, nestled in tissue, was a framed photo, her balcony from Deck 10, taken at golden hour. The sea in full glow, her scarf trailing over the rail like it had caught the breeze mid-flight. In the bottom corner, barely visible, a tiny reflection, her silhouette, wineglass in hand. She held it in her palms for a long time, then set it on the mantel. It belonged here now. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. She poured herself a glass of wine, Sauvignon Blanc, crisp and dry, and leaned against the kitchen counter, letting the silence settle. There had been a time, not too long ago, when that silence would have felt heavy. Now it felt earned. Maggie wandered to the hallway where her suitcase still stood. She unzipped it halfway, folded back a layer of silk, and reached for a padded folder tucked between her clothes. Inside, the cruise thank you letter. Typed on sovereign letterhead, signed by name, dozens of them. Thank you for seeing us, for noticing the work, for helping when no one had to. Some had scribbled personal notes in the margins. Come back soon, Ms. West. You made the week better. We won't forget. She pressed her fingers to one of the names, Elijah, the junior crewman who had handed her that intercom headset on the bridge. His handwriting curved upward, like hope. Maggie smiled. She didn't need validation anymore, but it was nice when it came from people who mattered. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen island, a message from Ethan. Hey, just wanted to say, you were right. About a lot. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Hope you made it home okay. She looked at it for a long moment, then locked the screen and left it face down. Let him sit with it. She slid open the back door and stepped onto her porch, where the breeze came off the coast like a rumor, warm and salty and filled with stories. The wind lifted the edge of her sleeve the way it had lifted her scarf on the ship, and for a moment she swore she could still hear the violinists playing beneath the stars. She settled into the chair by the railing, curled one foot beneath her, and sipped. The horizon here wasn't open ocean, but it was still wide enough. She glanced once toward the distant street where no one was watching. Good. She liked the quiet. But now she also liked the idea that somewhere, anywhere, someone might be wondering what she was planning next. She raised her glass slightly, to no one in particular, and smiled. "Next time," she said aloud, soft and certain, "I'll let them know I'm coming, just to watch their faces,